Hey guys, somewhere in medieval Europe, it is late. Very late. The kind of late where even the castle cats have stopped moving. Candles are still burning, but only a few. They flicker like they are tired too. Stone halls stretch out in long, quiet lines. Every footstep echoes like it means something. Far away, a bell rings once. Not loud. Just enough to remind everyone that time is still moving. This is the hour when whispers wake up. During the day, castles were loud places. Guards argued. Servants rushed. Horses snorted. Kings shouted. But at general midnight o'clock, everything changed. The halls calmed down. Fires went low. And people started leaning closer to each other. Voices dropped. Secrets came out. And in those quiet hours, scandal was born. Now, scandal did not mean what it means today. There were no tabloids. No phone cameras hiding in bushes. No social media posts that say, "You won't believe what the Queen just did." Back then, scandal meant rumor. And rumor was stronger than any sword. A single whisper could cross a kingdom faster than a royal messenger. It could ride on merchant carts, slip into taverns, and crawl into noble dinner parties. It moved quietly. Slowly. And then suddenly, everyone knew. A queen was not allowed to make mistakes. A king could lose a battle. He could lose his temper. He could even lose half his army and people would say, "Ah, well. Kings will be kings. But queens?" Queens had to be perfect statues with good posture. They were expected to smile nicely, speak softly, and produce airs on schedule like royal clockwork. They were supposed to be loyal, gentle, silent, and above all, spotless. Not in the cleaning sense. In the reputation sense. Because once a queen's name touched rumor, it never fully washed off. In medieval times, your reputation was your armor. You could be rich, powerful, and live in a stone castle, but if people believed bad things about you, your protection cracked. Nobles stopped trusting you. Allies hesitated. Enemies smiled a little too much. And queens were watched very closely. Every meal. Every visitor. Every look across a room. Who did she sit next to? Who did she talk to too long? Why did she laugh at that joke? Why did she walk in that garden at night? Even the curtains had opinions. This was a world where a woman holding power made people nervous. Very nervous. A queen was supposed to be powerful only in very safe ways, like looking royal and giving birth to future kings. Anything beyond that made the court start squinting suspiciously. And so the whispers began. Sometimes they were harmless. The queen prefers honey cakes over apple tarts. Scandalous. Truly shocking. The kingdom almost collapsed. But sometimes the whispers were darker. She meets a certain knight too often. She gives orders without asking the king. She knows too much. She wants too much. And once those words were said quietly enough times, they became truth. There were no newspapers, no official press releases, no fact-checkers. History was written by people who loved drama. Monks with quills were the medieval version of gossip blogs, except their words became permanent. If a chronicler decided you were suspicious, that opinion could live for 700 years. So a rumor did not just damage your life. It damaged your future ghost. And queens knew this. They walked carefully. They smiled carefully. They even sighed carefully. But no matter how gentle they were, they lived inside a castle that was basically a rumor factory. Servants heard everything. Guards saw everything. Priests guessed everything. And nobles improved the story to make it more exciting. Soon, a queen could simply breathe wrong and suddenly be known for her questionable nature. It sounds funny. It was not funny. Because behind those quiet whispers were real consequences. Marriages broke. Alliances fell apart. Wars started. Heads rolled. Sometimes literally. All because someone leaned in and said something like, "I probably should not say this, but..." That phrase has started more disasters than any sword. And it was always worse for queens. A king could be cruel and be called strong. A queen could be firm and be called dangerous. A king could have lovers and be called passionate. A queen could smile at one man and be called corrupting the realm. Double standards were not just present. They were built into the castle walls. So when we talk about scandalous queens, we are not just talking about wild behavior. We are talking about women who lived under constant watch. Women whose every movement could be twisted into a story. Women who had to survive politics, jealousy, religion, and rumor at the same time. They did not live in fairy tale castles. They lived in velvet traps. Beautiful on the outside. Dangerous on the inside. And at night, when the candles burned low, and footsteps faded, and bells rang far away, the whispers grew stronger. They slipped through doors. They curled around pillars. They climbed staircases and hid behind curtains. They waited. Because every queen had a story ready to be written about her. Whether she deserved it or not. And once the whispers started, they never really stopped. In medieval times, being a queen looked very fancy from far away. Crowns, velvet dresses, long halls, shiny cups, and people bowing all day long. It looked like a dream job. It was not. Being a queen came with a long list of rules. A very long list. A list so long it probably had its own chair in the room. Rule number 1, be quiet. Not silent, but polite quiet. Gentle quiet. Only speak when spoken to, quiet. Queens were expected to talk softly, move slowly, and never look like they were in a hurry. Rushing was for servants. Queens were supposed to float. Like royal ghosts in silk dresses. Rule number 2, be obedient. To your husband. To the church. To tradition. To people who were not even related to you but somehow still had opinions. Rule number 3, be modest. Not just in clothes, but in thoughts, words, and feelings. A queen was not supposed to want things too loudly. Not land. Not power. Not attention. Not even snacks. Basically, medieval queens were supposed to exist like beautiful furniture. Very important furniture. But still furniture. They were treated more like symbols than humans. A queen was peace between kingdoms. She was proof of alliance. She was future babies. She was God's blessing on the throne. Rarely was she just a person. Her feelings did not matter much. Her comfort did not matter much. Her opinion only mattered if it matched everyone else's opinion. Otherwise, it became a problem. Marriage was the biggest tool of all. Queens were married like treaties. A wedding could stop a war, start a war, or move borders without a single sword being lifted. A queen could wake up one morning as a princess in one country and go to sleep as political property in another. Sometimes they did not even meet their husband until the wedding day. Imagine packing your bags for forever and being told, surprise, this is your new life. Romance was optional. Obedience was not. Once married, the queen had one main job: produce heirs. Preferably boys. Preferably on time. Preferably without dying in childbirth. And preferably without complaining. If she failed at this, the whispers started. If she succeeded too slowly, the whispers started. If she succeeded too quickly, people got suspicious and the whispers still started. It was a no-win situation with very fancy curtains. So what happened when a queen stepped out of line? Well, history shows us a whole menu of consequences. Some queens were locked in towers, for their own safety. Some were sent to remote castles where nothing ever happened except cold wind and sadness. Some were forced to publicly apologize for things that were never proven. Some were accused of being unholy, immoral, or dangerous to the soul of the kingdom. And some simply vanished from the story. Which is history's way of saying, we do not want to talk about her anymore. Scandal was especially dangerous for royal women because it attacked the very thing that kept them powerful, reputation. A queen could not lead armies openly. She could not shout commands in public. She could not fight duels. Her power lived inside how people saw her. So if people believed she was unfaithful, dangerous, or not proper, her influence collapsed. Nobles stopped listening. Allies grew nervous. The church frowned very deeply. A king could survive rumors. A queen could be erased by them. And it did not even have to be true. Sometimes a queen simply spoke too confidently. Sometimes she advised the king too often. Sometimes she did not like certain nobles and they did not like her back. And suddenly she was known as difficult, cold, or ambitious. The medieval version of a bad online review. Queens had to smile while being measured by impossible standards. Too quiet. You are weak. Too loud. You are dangerous. Too kind. You are naive. Too firm. You are cruel. It was like walking on a rope made of rumors over a pit filled with historians. So when we read about scandalous queens, we should remember this. Many of them were not wild rebels running around castles throwing goblets. Many were simply women who spoke, acted, or thought a little too strongly for a world that wanted them silent. They were not meant to be loud. But some of them were brave enough to be heard anyway. And history never really forgave them for that. If medieval Europe had a most likely to cause gossip award, Eleanor of Aquitaine would have won it every year and still made people nervous while walking to accept it. She was rich, powerful, smart, and very much not interested in being quiet. Eleanor was born into Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest lands in Europe. She did not grow up thinking small thoughts. Her family owned so much land that maps basically had to stretch when her name was mentioned. From the start, she was not just a noble girl. She was a walking kingdom. And everyone wanted her. Kings wanted her land. Princes wanted her status. Nobles wanted her favor. And rumor writers wanted her life story. She became Queen of France first. She married King Louis VII. On paper, it looked perfect. Young king. Young queen. Big lands. Fancy wedding. Bells ringing. Choir singing. In real life, it was awkward. Louis was very religious. Quiet. Serious. The kind of man who probably apologized to chairs when he bumped into them. Eleanor was lively, curious, and loved conversation, music, poetry, and movement. She liked life. A lot. They did not match. Eleanor spoke her mind. Louis listened to monks. Eleanor enjoyed culture. Louis enjoyed praying. Eleanor wanted a strong partnership. Louis wanted peace and silence. And slowly, the whispers started warming up. Then came the crusade. Eleanor did something that was already considered bold. She went with her husband on the Second Crusade. Queens were not supposed to travel into war zones. But Eleanor packed her things and came anyway, probably with better luggage. During the crusade, rumors exploded. People claimed she was too close to certain knights. Some said she acted more like a leader than the king. Some even said she caused chaos among the troops. Did she? We do not really know. But what we do know is that the story was written mostly by men who were already uncomfortable with her presence. Soon, Eleanor was being painted as proud, reckless, and improper. Basically, she was accused of being too much. Too confident. Too social. Too influential. And in medieval times, too much was a crime. After years of tension, Eleanor and Louis ended their marriage. This was rare. Very rare. A queen leaving a king was not exactly normal behavior. But Eleanor did it anyway. Then she married again. And not just anyone. She married Henry Plantagenet, who later became Henry II of England. And just like that, Eleanor became Queen of England. 2 crowns. 2 kingdoms. And about 10 times more rumors. People whispered that she was manipulative. They said she controlled her husbands. They said she ruled from the shadows. What they really meant was, she was powerful and they did not like it. Eleanor was not a quiet decoration. She advised, planned, negotiated, and made decisions. She supported her sons. She helped shape politics across 2 kingdoms. So the stories got darker. She was accused of affairs. She was accused of plotting. She was accused of stirring rebellion. At one point, she was even imprisoned by her own husband for years. A queen in a tower because she had too much influence. Still, she did not disappear. She outlived kings. She outlived enemies. She outlived most of the people who criticized her. In her later years, she ruled as regent, managed kingdoms, arranged marriages, and still kept people guessing. Why did men fear her so much? Because she showed that a queen could be more than a crown and a womb. She showed that a woman could speak, travel, command, and shape politics without asking for permission every 5 minutes. She did not shout on battlefields. She did not wear armor. But her presence alone bent history. She quietly rewrote what queens could be. Not by screaming. Not by leading armies. But by simply refusing to shrink. Eleanor lived into her 80s. That was impressive enough. But more impressive was the fact that she never stopped being talked about. People still argue about her. Still whisper about her. Still wonder about her. And that is probably exactly how she would have liked it. Isabella of France arrived in England as a teenage queen with perfect manners, perfect posture, and a future that looked polite and safe. People called her the Fair Maid of France. She was beautiful, well-educated, and carried peace between 2 kingdoms in her suitcase. England thought they were getting a quiet royal decoration. They did not. Isabella married Edward II, King of England. On paper, it was a strong political match. In real life, it was uncomfortable. Edward did not really pay attention to his wife. He paid attention to his favorites. Very special favorites. Men who were always around, always whispering in his ear, always getting lands, titles, and way too much affection. At first Isabella tried to be patient. She smiled. She waited. She played the proper queen. But while she waited, Edward gave more power to his chosen companions than to his own wife. The court noticed. The nobles noticed. And the whispers grew louder. Soon, Isabella was not just ignored. She was pushed aside. Her money was limited. Her household was cut. Her influence shrank. It was like being queen, but on trial version. And that is when Isabella stopped being quiet. She found support among nobles who were already tired of Edward's behavior. And she found something else too. A lover. Roger Mortimer. Mortimer was bold, clever, and just as unhappy with the king as Isabella was. Their partnership was personal and political at the same time. Together, they did what very few dared to imagine. They planned to remove the king. Not quietly. Not politely. But completely. Isabella traveled to France, officially to negotiate peace. Unofficially, she built an army of supporters. She gathered ships. She gathered soldiers. And then she came back to England. With force. Edward II panicked. His favorites ran. Nobles switched sides like it was a fashion trend. And Isabella marched through England like she owned the place. Because, honestly, she kind of did. Edward was captured. He was forced to give up the crown to his son. Isabella became regent. Mortimer became her right hand. And suddenly, England was ruled by a queen who had just overthrown her own husband. The rumors exploded. People whispered about affairs. They whispered about betrayal. They whispered about murder. Because Edward II did not live long after losing his crown. He died in prison. And his death was mysterious. Some said it was illness. Some said it was neglect. Some said it was murder. And some stories were so dark that even medieval people raised their eyebrows. Whether Isabella ordered it or not, her name became tied to the death of a king. And that is how you earn a nickname like the She-Wolf of England. Under Isabella and Mortimer, England changed. They punished enemies. They took lands. They made decisions without asking the old nobles nicely. They ruled fast and hard. Too hard. Soon, people started whispering about them the same way they had whispered about Edward. Power moved. Greed followed. And the court grew nervous again. Eventually, Isabella's own son grew tired of being controlled. He took power for himself. Mortimer was executed. Isabella was pushed into quiet retirement. She was not killed. She was not erased. But she was no longer allowed to rule. Still, her shadow stayed long. Why did she terrify the royal court? Because she proved something dangerous. She proved that a queen could remove a king. She proved that marriage did not guarantee obedience. She proved that a woman could organize armies, shift nobles, and change the crown itself. She was not loud in speeches. She was loud in actions. And medieval power feared that more than shouting. Even centuries later, Isabella's name still feels sharp. Still feels bold. Still feels a little dangerous. Which is exactly why the whispers about her never really stopped. If you walked into the French court in the early 1200s, you would see a young king on the throne. He looked calm. He looked polite. He looked official. He wore the crown. But if you leaned a little closer, and listened to the quiet side of the room, you would hear a different truth. France was not being ruled by the king. It was being ruled by his mother. Her name was Blanche of Castile. And she did not need a crown to run a kingdom. Blanche married King Louis VIII of France. She was strong, sharp, and deeply serious about one thing: control. When her husband died, their son Louis IX was still a child. That made Blanche regent. Which is a fancy word for temporary ruler. But Blanche treated temporary like it meant as long as I feel like it. She took charge. And she did not let go. She made decisions. She handled nobles. She controlled money, armies, and law. She arranged marriages. She solved rebellions. She spoke for the crown. Her son sat on the throne. Blanche held the strings. At first, people accepted it. A child king needed help. That made sense. But as Louis grew older, Blanche did not step back. She leaned in. Court whispers began to spread. They said she was obsessed with her son. They said she did not want him to rule alone. They said she controlled his friends, his advisors, even his daily schedule. Some whispered that she chose who could speak to him. Some whispered that she chose what he could read. Some whispered that she chose what he could think. They started calling her too involved. Which in medieval language meant, too powerful. Blanche had one big advantage. She was very, very smart. She knew how to play nobles against each other. She rewarded loyal ones and froze out the troublemakers. She spoke softly but carried consequences. And she used the church carefully, always appearing as the perfect Christian queen while moving political pieces behind the scenes. She did not sit on the throne. She sat beside it. Which was even scarier. Because you could see the king. But you could not always see Blanche working. Nobles began to fear her more than they had feared kings. A king could be angry. A king could be careless. A king could be distracted. Blanche was none of those. She remembered names. She remembered favors. She remembered insults. And she waited. Several nobles tried to challenge her control. Some rebelled. Some complained. Some quietly tried to weaken her influence. None of them had much luck. Blanche crushed rebellions. Blanche replaced disloyal lords. Blanche protected the crown's power like it was her own heart. Because, in many ways, it was. She did not want France to be weak. And she did not want her son to be weak either. So she taught him discipline, religion, and loyalty to the crown above all else. Louis grew into one of France's most respected kings. Calm. Serious. Very controlled. Which is exactly how Blanche liked her kings. Even when Louis officially became an adult and king in his own right, Blanche stayed close. Very close. Too close, according to court gossip. They whispered that she still chose his advisors. They whispered that she still shaped his decisions. They whispered that she still guided him. And honestly, they were probably right. Blanche did not need to shout. She did not need to threaten loudly. Her power lived in routines, habits, and loyalty. It lived in the fact that everyone knew she was always watching. She was polite. She was calm. She was terrifying. Some people accused her of being cold. Some said she was too controlling. Some said she loved power more than she loved people. But here is the thing. She kept France stable. She protected her son. She kept nobles in line. She prevented chaos. And in medieval politics, stability was rare and valuable. Blanche controlled France without a crown because she understood something very important: real power does not always sit on the throne. Sometimes it stands right behind it, with a gentle smile and very sharp memory. When Blanche finally died, the court felt different. Quieter. Looser. Less tense. Nobles relaxed. Power shifted. And yet, many of them also felt a strange sense of loss. Because as strict as she was, Blanche had been the wall that kept France from falling into pieces. She was not loud. She was not flashy. She did not ride into battles with banners flying. She ruled in shadows, letters, whispers, and quiet meetings. Which made her one of the most powerful queens in medieval Europe. And one of the most feared. Not because she shouted. But because she never had to. If medieval England had a rulebook, Margaret of Anjou read it, closed it, and then used it to fan herself while doing the opposite. She was not supposed to be a general. She was not supposed to give battle orders. She was not supposed to shout at soldiers or argue with nobles about war plans. But then England had a civil war, and suddenly, nothing was supposed to be anything anymore. Margaret was born in France and married King Henry VI of England. Henry was gentle, quiet, religious, and very soft. He preferred prayer to politics and peace to decision-making. Which is nice. But not great when your kingdom is slowly falling apart. Henry struggled to rule. Nobles argued. Power groups formed. The country split into sides. And then Henry had a mental breakdown that left him unable to rule at all. So Margaret stepped forward. At first, people were surprised. Then they were uncomfortable. Then they were scared. Because Margaret did not whisper. She commanded. She began organizing supporters, planning movements, and gathering armies. She defended her son's right to the throne. And soon, she was leading the Lancastrian side in what became known as the Wars of the Roses. A queen had become a general. She did not just sit in castles and send polite letters. She traveled with troops. She made alliances. She gave speeches. She decided who fought and where. And the battlefield does not care about royal manners. People claimed she was cruel. They claimed she was cold. They claimed she enjoyed punishment and revenge. Some chroniclers even called her mad. But here is the thing. This was civil war. Neighbors fought neighbors. Families split. Cities changed sides overnight. And Margaret was trying to protect her son's crown in a world that was tearing itself apart. So she fought. And when a woman fought in medieval times, people did not call her strong. They called her unnatural. They said she broke tradition. They said she acted like a man. They said she was dangerous. She shattered the old idea of what a queen should be. She proved that a queen could not only influence power, but physically defend it. And that scared everyone. Her enemies painted her as a monster. They described her as heartless, violent, and obsessed with revenge. Some stories said she ordered executions with no mercy. Others said she enjoyed suffering. Do we know how much of this is true? Not really. What we do know is that history was written mostly by the side that defeated her. And they did not like her. Margaret lost the war. Her husband was imprisoned. Her son was killed. Her power collapsed. And suddenly, the stories about her became darker, louder, and more dramatic. She was turned into a villain. Not just a defeated queen. But a warning. A warning about what happens when women become too powerful, too visible, and too involved in war. England wanted to forget the chaos. And the easiest way to do that was to blame someone. So they blamed Margaret. She ended her life quietly in exile, far from the battlefield she once commanded. No army. No banners. No speeches. Just silence. But her shadow stayed long. Because she was one of the first queens to step fully into war leadership. And once someone shows what is possible, it is impossible to fully erase. She broke the quiet rules. She broke the soft image. She broke the tradition. And for that, history never fully forgave her. But deep down, England also never forgot her. If medieval Europe had a prize for most dramatic family story, Brunhilde of Austrasia would have taken it home and still found a way to turn it into a war. Her life was not a fairy tale. It was more like a long, dark soap opera with swords. Brunhilde was born a princess in Spain and married into the Frankish royal family. She became Queen of Austrasia, one of the powerful Frankish kingdoms. At first, her life looked proper and calm. Crown. Castle. Court life. Fancy dinners. All the usual royal stuff. Then her sister married into the neighboring kingdom. And that is when everything went very, very wrong. Her sister, Galswintha, married King Chilperic of Neustria. He promised love, loyalty, and respect. Then he went back to his old lover, a woman named Fredegund. Not long after, Galswintha was found dead. Strangled. Officially, it was mysterious. Unofficially, everyone knew what happened. And Brunhilde knew it too. From that moment, her life became one long revenge mission. She blamed Fredegund. She blamed Chilperic. She blamed their entire bloodline. And she never really stopped blaming them. What followed was not just a feud. It was a generational storm. Kingdoms fought. Families split. Children grew up knowing exactly who they were supposed to hate. Brunhilde became more than a queen. She became a symbol of vengeance. She pushed wars. She encouraged punishments. She supported enemies of her enemies. And every time someone from the other family fell, people whispered that Brunhilde was behind it. Soon, poisoning rumors started to grow. They said she poisoned rivals. They said she arranged accidents. They said she removed anyone who stood in her way. Were all of these stories true? Probably not. But enough of them felt possible that people believed them. Because Brunhilde was not gentle. She ruled firmly. She punished strongly. She did not pretend to be soft. And in medieval times, a woman who ruled firmly was already suspicious. A woman who ruled firmly while demanding revenge was considered terrifying. As years passed, Brunhilde survived multiple kings, shifting alliances, and changing borders. She ruled as regent for her grandsons. She stayed in power far longer than most queens ever did. But power makes enemies. And Brunhilde had many. Eventually, the family she had been fighting for decades finally turned the table. She was captured. Now here is where her story takes a dark turn. She was put on public trial. The charges were long and dramatic: murder, poisoning, cruelty, betrayal, and basically, being the cause of everything bad that has happened recently. Some accusations were real. Some were guesses. Some were probably added just to make the story more exciting. And then came the execution. It was not quiet. It was not gentle. It was not respectful. Brunhilde was paraded in public. She was humiliated. And then she was put to death in a brutal way that shocked even medieval people. Her execution was meant to send a message. A very clear one. This is what happens when a woman holds power too long and too strongly. After her death, chroniclers went to work. And they were not kind. They called her cruel. They called her unnatural. They called her a monster. They described her as evil, cold, and dangerous. They blamed wars, deaths, and chaos on her name. Her story became a warning tale written in ink and fear. But here is the quiet part people forget. Brunhilde lived in a world where violence was normal. Where kings killed kings. Where wars were common. Where revenge was not strange. She just refused to play soft. She refused to forget her sister. She refused to forgive her enemies. She refused to step aside quietly. And that made her unforgettable. So when medieval writers described her as a monster, what they were really saying was, she did not behave the way we wanted her to. Brunhilde did not live a calm life. She lived a loud, dangerous, angry one. She burned through generations. She left scars on kingdoms. She shook families. And even after her brutal death, her name kept being whispered. Not because she was gentle. But because she was powerful enough to be feared. And in medieval history, fear lasts a very long time. Love in medieval times was not a sweet poem and a walk in the garden. It was a political problem with very sharp edges. A queen was not allowed to love freely. She was allowed to marry. There is a difference. Marriage was business. Love was dangerous. And when love entered the royal palace, history usually started sweating. Queens were married to kings they barely knew. Sometimes they had met once. Sometimes not at all. So it is not shocking that feelings wandered. What is shocking is how badly that wandering could end. Forbidden love was one of the fastest ways to turn a peaceful court into a quiet war zone. A queen could not choose a lover without choosing a side. If she loved a noble from the wrong family, alliances shifted. If she favored a foreign knight, people whispered about betrayal. If she smiled at someone too long, nobles counted it as a political statement. Romance came with paperwork. One of the most famous examples is Queen Guinevere. Now, yes, she is more legend than history, but medieval people believed her story deeply. She loved Sir Lancelot. And that love helped break the Round Table and push Camelot into chaos. Even stories had political warnings. In real life, queens were watched closely. Their bedrooms were basically national security zones. Royal mistresses were another sensitive topic. Kings having mistresses was expected. Queens having lovers was considered dangerous, sinful, and suspicious. A queen with a lover was seen as a threat to royal bloodlines. People worried about heirs, loyalty, and control. A single rumor could make nobles panic. Sometimes these rumors were used on purpose. If a queen was too powerful, accusing her of an affair was an easy way to weaken her. You did not need proof. You only needed doubt. And doubt spreads fast. When a queen was accused of loving the wrong man, punishment could be harsh. Some queens were locked away. Some were publicly shamed. Some lost their lands and influence. Some simply vanished from court life like they had been quietly erased. Their lovers often suffered worse. Knights were executed. Nobles were stripped of titles. Families were punished. Love was treated like treason. Because in a royal court, it kind of was. And sometimes, love really did start wars. A queen favoring one noble family could push rivals into rebellion. A royal marriage broken by scandal could end alliances between countries. Entire armies could march because of who was or was not sleeping in the right bed. It sounds dramatic. It was. Kings fought duels. Nobles raised banners. Cities changed sides. All because someone fell in love. The court whispered. The church judged. The nobles calculated. And the queen stood in the center of it, with her feelings labeled as political danger. Love made queens human. Politics made that dangerous. So when we talk about queens who loved the wrong men, we are really talking about women who were trapped between duty and emotion, between survival and happiness. Sometimes they chose duty. Sometimes they chose love. History judged both choices harshly. And in a world built on alliances, borders, and bloodlines, a single heart could still shake a kingdom. Which is kind of beautiful. And also very, very terrifying. If medieval Europe had true crime podcasts, Joanna of Naples would have broken the internet. Her story has everything. A young queen. A forced marriage. A husband who dies in a very suspicious way. Angry relatives. Political chaos. And half of Europe arguing about who did what for the next few hundred years. So let's dim the lights and step into the mystery. Joanna was born into the royal family of Naples in the 1300s. From a young age, it was clear she would be important. Her family ruled a rich and strategic kingdom in southern Italy. Ports, trade, money, and power all flowed through Naples. So naturally, her future husband was chosen for her like a treaty with a face. She was arranged to marry Andrew of Hungary. He was a prince from a powerful foreign family. On paper, it was perfect. Two royal houses connected. Peace secured. Everyone smiles. In real life, it was tense. Joanna became Queen of Naples while still very young. Andrew arrived expecting to rule beside her. But the local nobles did not like him. They did not trust him. And they did not want a foreign prince running their kingdom. Andrew wanted power. Joanna already had power. And neither side wanted to share nicely. Court life turned cold. Andrew complained. Joanna hesitated. The nobles whispered. Andrew felt ignored. Joanna felt pressured. And the court slowly filled with quiet dislike. Then, one night, everything went very wrong. Andrew was found dead. He had been strangled. His body was left outside his room. There were signs of a struggle. And suddenly, Naples became a crime scene. The court froze. The nobles panicked. And everyone looked at Joanna. Did she do it? No one could prove it. But no one could stop asking. Some said she had ordered it. Some said her supporters did it to protect her throne. Some said foreign enemies were involved. Some said it was a mix of everyone. Joanna said she was innocent. But the problem with royal murders is that even innocence does not protect you from rumor. Andrew's family in Hungary was furious. They accused Joanna directly. They demanded justice. They demanded revenge. And Europe leaned in. Because when royalty fights royalty, everyone else pays attention. Soon, armies were moving. Alliances were forming. Letters were flying across borders. The death of one man started turning into international drama. Joanna tried to hold her throne. But the pressure was heavy. She faced rebellion, invasion threats, and constant whispers. Eventually, she was forced into exile. Imagine being queen of a kingdom, then suddenly being pushed out of your own land because people think you might have had your husband killed. That is medieval justice. While in exile, Joanna tried to rebuild her power. She remarried. She made new alliances. She planned her return. And she did return. But Naples was never calm again. Every decision she made was questioned. Every enemy she punished was proof of cruelty. Every problem was blamed on her. She was no longer just Joanna. She was Joanna the Suspicious. Wars broke out around her reign. Nobles rebelled. Foreign powers invaded. Her kingdom became unstable. And behind every conflict was the same shadow. Did she kill her husband? Some believed yes. Some believed no. Some believed it did not matter anymore. Europe argued for generations. Chroniclers wrote different versions. Some painted her as a cold schemer. Others described her as a trapped young woman crushed by politics and false blame. The truth? We will probably never know. But here is what we do know. Joanna lived in a world where a queen's reputation was more powerful than proof. Once her name touched suspicion, everything she did became suspicious. Her mistakes became crimes. Her decisions became evidence. Her survival became guilt. She spent her life trying to rule under a cloud she did not create. And that cloud followed her until the end. She was eventually captured by her enemies and killed. Quietly. Without ceremony. Without apology. No final verdict. No official answer. Just silence. So did Joanna of Naples really do it? Maybe. Maybe not. But her story shows something very clear. In medieval times, a queen did not need to commit a crime to be punished. She only needed to be believed capable of it. And once that belief spread, it could destroy a life, a kingdom, and a name forever. Which makes Joanna's story less about murder. And more about the quiet danger of rumor wearing a crown. In medieval times, if a woman had too much power, too much confidence, or too much influence, people did not always say, "Wow, she is skilled." They said, that feels like witchcraft." Because in a world where science was weak and superstition was strong, power that could not be easily explained made people uncomfortable. Especially when it came from queens. When power became magic, it meant one thing: someone was about to be accused of something dark. Independent queens were the most common targets. A queen who listened too much to her own mind. A queen who ruled while her husband was weak. A queen who made decisions without male approval. All of them were dangerous. Not because they were actually witches, but because they broke expectations. Medieval courts were full of superstitions. People believed in curses, omens, evil eyes, lucky charms, and bad dreams that could predict death. A strange illness? Maybe magic. A failed harvest? Someone cursed it. A sudden death? Definitely suspicious. So when something went wrong in the kingdom, people started looking around for a cause. And sometimes they looked straight at the queen. She advised the king. She chose that minister. She wears strange perfume. She reads too much. Boom. Witch. Rumors were enough. Proof was optional. Courts whispered about queens who knew too much. They whispered about queens who kept private rooms, who talked to healers, who used herbs, who prayed differently, who stayed calm during bad times. Calm was suspicious. Knowledge was suspicious. Independence was very suspicious. Once a queen was accused, fear spread fast. People imagined curses in wine cups. They imagined spells in jewelry. They imagined demons hiding behind curtains. And fear is a powerful storyteller. Some queens faced real trials. They were questioned, humiliated, and forced to prove their innocence. Some were locked away. Some were exiled. Some lived under constant watch, like their crown came with invisible chains. And some did not survive. Public fear made everything louder. Crowds wanted answers. Priests demanded repentance. Nobles demanded control. And the queen stood at the center, blamed for storms, sickness, and bad luck. But here is the quiet truth. Witchcraft accusations were often just political weapons. If a queen was too strong, calling her a witch made her weaker. If she was unpopular, it made people afraid of her. If someone wanted her land, her removal became holy duty. You could not argue against magic. You could not reason with fear. So witchcraft became a way to erase women from power while pretending it was about protecting souls. It was control dressed as religion. Some queens were never formally tried but lived their lives under suspicion. They had guards watching them, servants reporting on them, and priests monitoring their words. They became isolated. Lonely. Careful. All because someone decided their power looked unnatural. The scariest part? Once a queen was labeled witch, her whole life was rewritten. Her good deeds were ignored. Her mistakes were proof. Her survival was dark protection. And history remembered her through that shadow. Not as a ruler. Not as a woman. But as a warning. So when we hear about medieval queens accused of witchcraft, we are really hearing about fear of female power. Fear of independence. Fear of change. They were not punished for spells. They were punished for standing too tall in a world that wanted them smaller. And that fear still echoes in old castle halls. Long after the candles went out. Medieval castles looked calm. Stone walls. Tapestries. Candles. Soft music. But behind all that beauty was one very real fear. What if your dinner was trying to kill you? In a world with no food labels, no ingredient lists, and no health inspectors, the royal kitchen was a mysterious place. And mysterious places make people nervous. Poison became the favorite invisible weapon in royal rumor stories. Not swords. Not arrows. Not loud battles. Poison was quiet. It did not scream. It did not wear armor. It slipped into wine cups, soups, and desserts while everyone smiled politely. And queens were often blamed. Not because they were proven guilty, but because they were close enough to the food. Silent weapons were more suspicious than loud ones. If someone died suddenly, people wanted an explanation. And poison was the perfect one. He looked fine yesterday. He drank 1 cup. He never woke up. Must be poison. Then came the rumors. She prepared the meal. She chose the cook. She was seen near the wine. Boom. Case closed. In whispers, at least. Perfumed gloves became famous in medieval imagination. The idea was that poison could be hidden inside fine leather gloves. A handshake could be dangerous. Jewelry could be deadly. Even letters could carry invisible harm. Some of this was possible. Most of it was not. But fear does not care about facts. Royal kitchens were watched closely. Servants were questioned. Tasters were used. And even then, people were still nervous. Imagine being paid to taste food for a king. That job description came with a lot of risk and very little thanks. Queens who were powerful, unpopular, or simply unlucky were often blamed for secret deaths. If a rival noble died, people whispered about her. If a husband died, they definitely whispered about her. If a bishop caught a strange illness, somehow her name appeared. It was like a dark version of Connect the Dots. Some queens were accused of poisoning husbands. Some were accused of poisoning rivals. Some were accused of poisoning entire families. Proof was rare. Stories were loud. Poison rumors spread faster than any official message. They moved through taverns, churches, and noble halls. By the time the truth arrived, the story was already settled in people's minds. A queen could spend years being known as dangerous because of one whispered accusation. And the fear stuck. Once labeled, she had to live carefully. Guards watched her. Servants reported on her. Every meal became suspicious. And every cough became evidence. The palace became a place of tension. Smiles looked fake. Toasts felt dangerous. Even celebrations had a nervous edge. Because in medieval courts, danger did not always walk with a sword. Sometimes it walked with dessert. And queens were the easiest people to blame for it. They were close to power. They were close to kitchens. They were close to rumors. Which made them close to trouble. In truth, poison was used sometimes in medieval politics. But not nearly as often as stories suggested. Most sudden deaths were probably illness, infection, or bad food. But poison made better stories. And stories made better control. If people believed a queen was dangerous, she became easier to isolate. Easier to silence. Easier to remove. So poison rumors were not just about fear. They were tools. And once again, queens stood in the center of them. Silent. Watched. And always one rumor away from disaster. In medieval courts, being beautiful was not always a blessing. Sometimes it was a warning sign. You could walk into a great hall, wearing silk and gold, and feel everyone watching you. Some were impressed. Some were curious. And some were quietly planning your future problems. Because beauty created attention. And attention created fear. The jealousy of courts was quiet but sharp. Noble ladies compared dresses. Noblemen compared glances. And queens stood at the center of it all, like living mirrors reflecting everyone's insecurity. If a queen was admired too much, people got nervous. She has too much influence. She distracts the king. She is dangerous. Not because she did anything wrong, but because people looked at her. And looking was considered powerful. Beauty could soften kings, shift moods, and change decisions. And in a political world, mood was everything. So a queen who could charm simply by walking into a room was considered risky. Seduction rumors grew easily. She smiles too much. She stands too close. She laughs at the wrong man's jokes. That was enough. Soon, her kindness became flirting. Her politeness became manipulation. Her presence became corruption. And once those stories started, they stuck. Some queens were publicly humiliated for being too charming. They were forced to apologize. They were moved to remote castles. Some were stripped of power and surrounded by guards like walking scandals. A few were punished more harshly. Public punishments were meant to send messages. And humiliation was one of the strongest messages of all. Queens were paraded. Queens were isolated. Queens were blamed. All because people believed their beauty was dangerous. Beauty became a crime. Not because of what it was, but because of what others feared it could do. In medieval courts, being admired could be as risky as being powerful. And sometimes even more dangerous. So queens learned to lower their eyes, soften their voices, and dim their shine. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to survive. And still, the whispers never fully stopped. Castles look strong. Thick walls. Heavy gates. Towers that cut the sky. They look like places that keep danger out. But for many medieval queens, castles became the place where everything quietly ended. Not in fire. Not in battle. But in silence. A queen could fall faster than anyone else. One season she was sitting under silk canopies, listening to music, and choosing which noble families would be invited to dinner. Servants rushed when she entered a room. Guards straightened their backs. Nobles lowered their voices. Then one rumor appeared. Then another. And suddenly the same halls felt colder. Downfall did not always arrive with shouting. It often arrived with a quiet knock on the door. Her Grace is requested in the North Tower. That was how it started. Not with chains. But with polite words. The North Tower was rarely warm. It was not meant to be. Towers were built for watchmen, storage, and prisoners who were not meant to be seen. Queens were often placed there for safety, which meant out of sight and out of conversation. From that moment, life changed. Rooms got smaller. Meals got simpler. Visitors became rare. Days slowed down until they felt heavy. A queen who once had dozens of servants might now have two. Sometimes one. Sometimes none. And silence began to grow. Queens in towers lived strange half-lives. They were not free. But they were not publicly condemned either. They were simply paused. Frozen in time while the rest of the court moved on without them. Some were imprisoned because of scandals that were never proven. Some because nobles feared their influence. Some because a new king wanted to clean the court of old problems. No trial was needed. No proof was required. All that mattered was that someone powerful wanted them gone. After the tower came the confessions. Confessions were neat. Confessions were useful. They gave people a clean ending to a messy story. A queen could be pressured to admit things she never did. She was told it would bring peace. She was told it would help her family. She was told it was God's will. Some confessed. Some resisted. Some were broken by long isolation. Once a confession existed, it became truth. And truth could be carved into stone, written into records, and whispered into history. Then came public shaming. Queens were brought out in simple clothes. No jewels. No crowns. They were made to apologize before nobles who once bowed to them. Their titles were stripped away. Their names were spoken with disappointment instead of respect. This was not done to correct mistakes. It was done to erase power. A queen who had been shamed could no longer influence court life. Her words sounded smaller. Her presence felt weaker. And soon, she was moved out of the main story of the kingdom. And finally, there were the quiet deaths. Some queens died of illness in cold rooms. Some of heartbreak. Some simply faded after years of being forgotten. No great bells rang. No poems were written. No songs were sung. Their deaths were recorded in short lines. On this day, she passed. And that was it. But behind those short lines were long nights, lonely mornings, and women who once stood at the center of kingdoms. They lost their crowns. They lost their voices. They lost their names. And in medieval history, losing your name was the final loss of all. Because once your name fades, your story ends. And for many queens, that was the quietest and cruelest ending of all. History books look calm. They sit quietly on shelves. They wear neat covers. They smell like dust and serious thinking. They pretend to be neutral. They pretend to be fair. They pretend to be facts wrapped in paper. But medieval history was not written in quiet classrooms. It was written in stone castles, in candlelight, by men who were tired, biased, loyal to kings, and often slightly annoyed by powerful women. So before we even talk about queens being monsters, we should ask a simple question. Who was holding the pen? Most medieval stories were written by monks, priests, court clerks, and royal historians. These men depended on kings and noble families for protection, money, food, and sometimes just the right to stay alive. Which means their loyalty was not neutral. If a queen challenged a king, or made nobles uncomfortable, or held power too strongly, she became a problem. And problems were written about in certain ways. A king who punished enemies was firm. A queen who punished enemies was cruel. A king who ruled strongly was decisive. A queen who ruled strongly was unnatural. Same actions. Different words. Very different future reputations. Then came propaganda. When kingdoms fought, swords were not the only weapons. Stories were weapons too. Destroying your enemy's image made it easier to destroy their alliances, their support, and their memory. So chroniclers wrote dark stories about rival queens. They wrote about poison. They wrote about secret lovers. They wrote about witchcraft and madness. Sometimes they had proof. Often they did not. But once something was written down, it became solid. Ink does not forget. And people trust ink. Soon, rumors became paragraphs. Paragraphs became chapters. Chapters became known history. No one questioned them. Why would they? The queen was already gone. The winning side was already in power. And nobody gets paid to defend a defeated woman from 100 years ago. So lies became truth. And those truths were copied again and again, through generations of writers who trusted earlier writers more than actual evidence. It was the medieval version of copy-paste. Over time, the queens were no longer remembered as rulers, mothers, diplomats, or survivors. They were remembered as villains. As witches. As manipulators. As monsters. And here is the quiet part. We are still repeating these stories today. When you hear about an evil medieval queen, you are often hearing a version of her written by her enemies. Written by men who were afraid of her power. Written by people who benefited from her fall. So sometimes, the monster was not the queen. Sometimes, the monster was the story that swallowed her. And that story has been whispering through books for centuries. Which means the whispers never really stopped. By the time the candles burn low and the halls go quiet, a strange question always seems to float through medieval castles. Were these queens really villains? Or were they just trying to survive? Because when you step back from the rumors, the accusations, the dramatic stories, and the scary nicknames, you start to see something softer hiding underneath. You start to see women living inside very violent systems. Medieval politics was not gentle. It was built on war, bloodlines, betrayal, and fear. Kingdoms rose and fell fast. Families were erased. Alliances shifted like weather. And queens stood right in the middle of it all, wearing silk while standing on very sharp ground. They did not get to choose their roles. They were married into foreign lands. They were expected to produce heirs. They were expected to keep peace. They were expected to stay quiet. They were expected to be perfect. And they were judged for everything. If they were too quiet, they were weak. If they spoke up, they were dangerous. If they were kind, they were naive. If they were firm, they were cruel. There was no safe setting. So what did survival look like? Sometimes it looked like alliances. Sometimes it looked like sharp political moves. Sometimes it looked like distancing from enemies. Sometimes it looked like standing your ground when everyone wanted you gone. And sometimes survival looked messy. A queen who protected her son was called controlling. A queen who defended her lands was called aggressive. A queen who influenced the court was called manipulative. But behind all those words was usually the same thing. A woman trying not to disappear. Because disappearing was easy. A single rumor could lock you in a tower. A single accusation could erase your power. A single marriage could move you into danger. So queens learned to watch people closely. To build loyalty. To remember favors. To protect their position. And that protection was often misread as ambition. What did power really cost them? It cost comfort. It cost privacy. It cost safety. It cost peace. They lived under constant watch. Their rooms were never truly private. Their letters were read. Their visitors were judged. Their bodies were treated like national property. Their lives were not soft. And when they failed, they did not just lose titles. They lost freedom. They lost reputation. They lost their future. So when we look at medieval queens and hear the word villain, it is worth slowing down. Because sometimes that villain was just a woman trying to stay alive in a world that was already violent, already unfair, and already dangerous. They were not perfect. They were not saints. But they were not monsters either. They were survivors wearing crowns. And in a world built on swords, sometimes survival was the bravest act of all. The castle is quiet now. Not the empty kind of quiet. The old kind. The kind that feels full of breath, memory, and very slow time. Candles burn low in iron holders. Their light trembles against stone walls that have seen centuries of footsteps. Wax slides down slowly, like the castle itself is getting tired and leaning into sleep. Somewhere, far down a long corridor, you hear a soft sound. Maybe a door settling. Maybe the wind. Maybe nothing at all. Old buildings make sounds just to remind you they are still here. This is the hour when castles remember. During the day, these halls belong to visitors, guides, cameras, and polite signs that say, "Do not touch." But at night, all of that fades away. The ropes disappear in the dark. The signs lose their voices. And what remains is what has always been here. The past. You can walk slowly through a hallway and feel it. The stone under your feet is worn smooth, not by time, but by people. Silk shoes. Leather boots. Bare feet. Nervous steps. Confident steps. Steps that hurried. Steps that paused. Steps that did not know what waited at the end of the hall. This is where queens once walked. Not the painted queens from portraits. Not the legends. Not the villains from rumors. Real women. You can almost picture them. A queen holding a candle close to her chest, careful not to drip wax onto her sleeve. Her dress rustles softly as she walks. Her thoughts are loud, even though the hall is quiet. She is thinking about letters, alliances, children, threats, and tomorrow. Another queen pauses at a window. She looks out into the dark gardens. She cannot see much, but she listens to the trees moving in the wind. She wonders what people are saying about her tonight. She wonders who still supports her. She wonders who does not. A third queen sits alone at a small table in a side room that no one visits anymore. She is writing a letter. She chooses her words carefully. Too soft, and she sounds weak. Too firm, and she sounds dangerous. She erases a line. Then another. Then finally signs her name, knowing it will be read by people who already decided what they think of her. These were not fairy tale lives. They were careful lives. Measured lives. Lives lived inside rules that could break you for breathing wrong. These queens did not move freely. They did not love freely. They did not speak freely. They lived inside systems built on swords, bloodlines, and fear. They were asked to be calm in violent worlds. Gentle in cruel times. Perfect in impossible situations. And yet, they lived. They made choices. They tried to protect children. They tried to protect kingdoms. They tried to protect themselves. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they did not. And when they fell quietly. No trumpets. No long speeches. Just small rooms, stone walls, and fading names. History moved on. New kings arrived. New queens replaced them. New stories were written. And the old ones slowly slipped into the background. But castles remember. They remember footsteps on stairs that no longer echo. They remember rooms that feel colder than others. They remember towers that seem to watch the horizon even when no one is inside. There is always one hallway that feels heavier than the rest. One room that makes you lower your voice. One window that feels like someone once stood there and waited. Those places are not haunted. They are remembered. And at night, when the world finally slows down, those memories wake up. Not loudly. Not dramatically. They whisper. They whisper that someone once stood here and hoped. They whisper that someone once stood here and feared. They whisper that someone once stood here and tried. They whisper that history did not always tell the full story. They whisper that crowns were heavy. They whisper that survival was sometimes the bravest thing they could do. So as you rest, imagine the castle growing quiet around you. Imagine the candles burning down to small glowing circles. Imagine the halls settling, the doors relaxing, the stone cooling under moonlight. And remember. These queens were not just names. They were not just scandals. They were not just villains or legends. They were people who lived real lives in dangerous worlds. Their stories still walk the halls. Their names still live in the walls. Their whispers still float through stone corridors long after the crowns have faded. And tonight, as the castle sleeps, so can you. Because the halls are calm. The candles are low. And history is finally resting. Softly. Quietly. Patiently. Good night.